I would like to welcome Dr. Frauke Bey. I can say that she's our friend in Al-Multaqa, and we are glad to have you here this year with us again. I would like to give a little introduction about Dr. Frauke. She received a PhD from
Freie Universität.
Okay, thank you. Of West Berlin in 1967 and joined the Center for Documentation and Research in Abu Dhabi in 1969. She was with the center for 39 years. Dr. Bey researched into the social, economic, and constitutional history and current developments of the countries of the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula, have led to several books and over 70 articles. Notable publications include From Trucial State to United Arab Emirates, A Society in Transition, Dubai, 2004. This book has been translated into French, Arabic, and German. From Tribe to State, the transformation of political structure in 5 states of the GCC. Milano, 2008. Frau continues to live in Abu Dhabi with her husband, David. Welcome, David. Her ongoing interest in the region manifests itself in research projects, her own and helping those of younger colleagues. And as we know, Dr. Frauke, that you've written a book recently. The name of the book is Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates, and the Gulf region, 50 years of transformation. And I want to tell you a little introduction about the book. The unexpected decision of the British government in January 1968 to withdraw its military and diplomatic protection from the Gulf catapulted the region into the limelight. For the following 5 decades, the historian Dr. Frauke Bey was best placed to observe subsequent developments in the Gulf. This work covers a broad spectrum, including the formation of the UAE in 1971, the subsequent development of this federation, the first oil crisis and geopolitical repercussions, labor migration, electoral system, trade, the changing way of life, and its implication for traditional loyalties in the Gulf states and Oman. Welcome, Dr. Frauke, and I will give you the mic now to tell us more about the book and about what is there in the book for the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Musa, for this introduction. And yes, we are on the Silk Road. We are going to China, but I stopped halfway. So here I am, and I spent my life in this place, halfway between Europe and China. I have not been to China. My husband has been when I was pregnant with our son in 1975, but that's beside the point. What I mean is that the Middle East has captured me. I came here by, I would almost say, not by my own free will. My husband has a job here. We got married, and so I came here. But it is important that we consider also that this is called the Middle East. We are in the Middle East, which is a very European way of looking at the world, because it is looking at the world from an idea that Europe is reaching culturally all the way to China, and on the way between Europe and China, there is the Middle East. But for many centuries, I would think, for people who considered this extension of culture into the East, the Middle East really constituted the wonders of Baghdad, of of Damascus, the cultures of Cairo, and so on. The Gulf was a forgotten entity. And that's where I ended up, in the Gulf, in Abu Dhabi, in a town that nobody had ever heard about when I left Berlin. So what did I do here? First I tried to learn some Arabic, but I didn't even have any decent books to learn Arabic with. But my husband's company had a little, they had someone who was teaching a little bit of Arabic, but not with the writing. But anyway, it was a good start, a good beginning. And yeah, here I am now talking about a book which is the newest and latest of my publications. And this book in part, in fact, in the italic, all the text that's written in italics explained a little bit of why I wrote what is in the book. But the main content of this new book is actually 30 articles, 30 pieces that constitute partly articles that I had published a long time ago in journals which are no longer available or are very, very hard to get. And other articles are presentations at conferences which have never been published. And then in between, I explain a little bit how every piece came about. And so you also learn a little bit about my life here over now nearly 50 years. And so the undertitle of the book is actually 50 Years of Transformation. I hope it is not my transformation. I didn't fatten out very much. Also, I love the dates that one can have here. But the transformation of not only the UAE, but of the Gulf. I had always had an eye on opportunities to travel in other parts of the Gulf, which in the first instance, when I came in '67, was not necessarily the done thing. In fact, when I came to live in Abu Dhabi, and we were fortunate enough to have one of the 36 houses which the oil company had built for their families. And they were comfortable bungalows with air conditioning. So when people in Europe, they thought we were living in tents, I could assure them we were not living in tents. But a lot of Abu Dhabi town was still Arish. People lived in the Arish houses, but very, very soon all these people were rehoused in what they called low-cost houses, and all this development was just going on around us. We almost, every week one took a little turn, and there was yet another building under construction. So to be in Abu Dhabi was in many ways, the company had this, as my husband's company called this, a hardship post. We didn't feel any hardship. But when I say that I tried to very soon to find out more about my environment, that was certainly not necessarily something that our colleagues and the other ladies were very keen on. In fact, we knew people who had lived in Abu Dhabi for 2 years and they hadn't even crossed the Makda Bridge. This bridge was just, when I came, it had just been built, completed just before I came in '67. So they were entirely content to not venture off the island. I have to add that it also meant that one would have to have had a four-wheel drive car. And the most of the Land Rovers, the old Land Rovers that were around, actually were company property or hired for the company and not necessarily for private use. And one had to know someone who had their own old battered down Land Rover to get off the island. So these people were in fact excused. And there were people who had also been in the Middle East longer than I had before. Many of them had already lived in Iraq and had a very cushy life there. And others had lived in Bahrain and had also found it extremely tiresome and cumbersome that they now had to relocate to Abu Dhabi. So they were not terribly keen on exploring. However, David and I were very, very lucky in that just 4 weeks after I arrived, there was a chance, there was an Eid and New Year fell on the same time, and there were 5 days company holidays. And some people in the company who actually owned or had access to Land Rovers, these old unair-conditioned short fares, and it was decided that one would go up country, and one very kind geologist invited the 2 of us to come with him because his wife was in England with the children over Christmas. So the 3 of us were sitting in front. There was on the back you had plenty of water, plenty of benzene, of petroleum, and a few bits and pieces for camping, which were very basic, rudimentary. It was the sort of beds one has on one's patio, and the bedding from the bed, and off we went. And on that occasion, it was, we were very, very lucky to be able to visit all 7 crucial states. It was at a time when there were no roads and certainly no maps to indicate the tracks. And some of the tracks were proper tracks. There was one road, I must correct myself, there were 14 kilometers between Dubai and Sharjah. That was already tarmac road. And we rolled along that very happily. But to begin with, it was a journey where one had to, first of all, spend a lot of time at the municipality, the Baladia. And because it was a holiday, everybody else was at the Baladia, local people who wanted to go to Al Ain. And everybody had to get some sort of pass called Chiti, and with passport and so on, or some identification, something, the name. And with this piece of paper, one arrived at the Magda Bridge in the predecessor of the building, which is there now, and one's name was entered in a book, and you got a stamp or whatever. And then if you went to Al Ain, you had the same procedure at the place before Al Ain, where the big dune starts. If you went to Dubai, you had this outside Dubai. You enter your name, and on the return journey, it was the same thing. So it took a long time even to get away from Abu Dhabi. The road between Abu Dhabi and Dubai was on Sabqa, and it had the breadth of about, I don't know, a kilometer or more. It was a track that was by use on the Sabqa, and it got wider and wider when people felt they could do a shortcut somewhere, and then others followed, and others followed, so there was a new track. You never quite knew which was the best or the right track. But anyway, so in the process of all this, we actually spent New Year's Eve in the desert. Well, it was in the desert, on the salty Sabqa between Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And so we proceeded, and eventually we went to Dubai and then Sharjah. And I remember Al Quwain, this lovely creek with lots of flamingos, pink flamingos, and we didn't see much else of Al Quwain. And then there was a piece of road between probably about Ajman and Ras Al Khaimah, where there was some earthwork going on, and I believe that the Saudi government had already promised to build a road there, but it was nothing much. So the idea, and because it was that area then was very sandy, those who were in the know actually knew that it was best to go hard along the shore where the receding water had sort of made the beach navigable, and so that's what one did. And so we got to Ras Al Khaimah, and then eventually down to Fujairah, and so on. Anyway, what I wanted to say was that I was extremely lucky to have had this chance of seeing all the trucial states in their really in the state that was before all the changes came. And I am now going to read you, if I could take the book for a moment, because I don't want to give only a travelogue. What I was going to say was read a passage of the very beginning of the introduction that I've written to this book. And it is not my words, it is written by David Holden, who was a very esteemed journalist who has written about the Middle East. He was writing for the Times and maybe some other British newspapers. And in one of his books, he writes, and that was written in 1957, "The farther south you go to the Gulf, the more the old Arabian world asserts itself. In Kuwait, the old world is virtually dead. In Bahrain, it is clearly dying. Also, it is taking an unconscionable time about it. But on the Trucial coast of Oman, the ancient life of Arabia persisted almost unchallenged until the other day, and the rhythm and customs still seem paramount." Now, that was written in 1947 by someone who had been all around the Middle East, in particularly also in South Yemen. So 10 years later, he has written this in 57, 10 years later I came to Abu Dhabi in 67. So I have put this in front of my book, which, as I said earlier, is a collection of very, very different bits and pieces that I've written over the many years. I will briefly introduce the sequence of this collection. It is, I have made 3 parts, and the publisher was very kindly went along with this suggestion. And part 1 is entitled "The World Apart," A World Apart, the Gulf in the 1960s and 70s. So that involves a lot of material that I have written for specialized journals and so on, but also other things that concerned me in that time. For instance, there's one article, "The Role of Archives in Conjunction with Oral History," or another completely different thing, a journey into the Liwa, because I was also lucky enough to have been with a French journalist together, the two of us were the first European women to go to the Liwa and back again by road. There had been others, oil company wives, who had the chance to fly there and go around a bit and fly back. But anyway, meaning that, and come back actually meant that my husband David was quite worried on that occasion when it was built that we would be away 4 days, and we went with 3 cars from our center and drivers whose family lived in the Liwa, and all 3 cars were loaded again with mostly water and petrol. And anyway, on the way back, we came across a local family of the Manasir, and the drivers said, "Oh, you know, these are the European visitors, and they're visitors of Sheikh Zayed," and so on. They overstated things a bit. You know, we were sent from our center where I worked anyway, and the family said immediately, you have to stay, and we, you know, kill a sheep and so on. So the whole evening, and we couldn't get away, so we camped nearby and came back a day late, and David had already been to the Magda Bridge several times, where there is, still now, there's a police station, and he sort of asked it, you know, I mean, there was no other way to get onto the island than past the Magda Bridge. Had they seen these 3 cars? And of course they hadn't. But anyway, he thought he had to be able to do something. Now, this first part also, there are other things. For instance, an article, The Tribal Society of the UAE and the Traditional Economy. That was an article that I'd been asked to write for a book that was published in the UAE, by the UAE, for the for the anniversary of the 25th year of the foundation of the United Arab Emirates. And again, the beginning of the post-imperial era for the crucial states from World War I to 1960s. Again, that was an article that was in the same book. But other things have been published, for instance, in Asian Affairs, which is the journal for the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. And that, in fact, was the first sort of article that I published abroad in England, and it came out of a conference that I had given in Cambridge in 1970, yes, and then these were the sort of conference then was published in 2 parts. So Asian Affairs, there are two parts in there. What else was there? In the first part is also Abu Dhabi's greatest ancestor, Sheikh Zayed bin Khalifa, that, the grandfather of our revered Sheikh Zayed. And he also has obviously a big role to play in Abu Dhabi's history, so he certainly warrants publication. And so there are various bits and pieces in the first part. The second part then is there are 7 articles, all to do with the federation. Now, this is something my particular interest has often been at the university and elsewhere, constitution and constitutional history. And this federation, the United Arab Emirates, is a fascinating example to see how a state that was formed not long ago, how it developed and changed, and also how the constitution did or did not play a role in it. And over now 45 years, there is much to be said about the changes which the UAE as a state, as an institutional state, has undergone. And it has always interested me, and there have always been institutions that also wanted an article also from me about these matters. So I have more than once, in fact 7 times, addressed these particular issues. And for instance, here is one that was published in Washington in the Middle East Journal, and it's called The United Arab Emirates, Statehood and Nation Building in a Traditional Society. And then something was published in Germany, in Orient, Hard Choices, United Arab Emirates, Development from Obscurity to Prominence. And that sort of, topics one sometimes has to jazz up one's title a little so that people realize that here's something really interesting they should take note of. So the third part of this majmua is entitled Regional Politics, Past and Present. And that is where a lot of other things got collected. The first one in this is entitled The Gulf in the 20th Century. Now here I now branch out into in earlier things as well. Sometimes it's concerned with the Gulf in general and Gulf countries, Oman and so on. But here the Gulf in the 20th century was was a presentation that I was invited to give to the Royal Society for Asian Affairs for their 100-year celebration. And I was very, very honored, I feel, because as a woman and as a German, to be asked to do this in an essentially very, very British organization was a great honor, and I hope I did it justice, I hope. But anyway, they then printed the presentation in the Society's journal, Royal Society for Asian Affairs. Now, what else is in there? A mixed badge. There is, for instance, a title, Horses in the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula and the Trade with India, an overview in the 19th and 20th century. It was something that just, I can't remember what conference it was for, but I just thought it is very interesting to follow up on the Arabian horse and what it I'm not an expert on horses, so I left that. But the fact that the British India, whenever they had any need for horses, particular for the war, for their many military needs, they needed horses. And where did the best horses come from? Of course, from Arabia via Baghdad and ultimately Basra as well. And there was a very lively trade in horses down the Gulf. And that suddenly finished when? The First World War, when it showed itself that you don't make war sitting on horses anymore. You make war sitting in armored cars and so on, and the development suddenly totally was overtaking the horses. But it is interesting to think that mankind has for millennia been reliant on the horse for moving. If they didn't walk, then you had a horse, or of course a camel. But even in Arabia also, when you needed to be in a war situation, they brought the camel. The camel was carrying the food for the horse, and before you get into battle, you jump off your camel and jump on your horse, and the horse is in many areas anyway. That was the case. So even the camel was also very indispensable for transport. So is the donkey, of course. But anyway, I won't go into this, but it just interested me, that the role of the horse. And then another piece here is, I entitled it Ballot Boxes and Other Forms of Participation in 5 countries of the GCC, where I've then followed the fact that elections were introduced here and in Oman and in Kuwait and Bahrain and so on, and all these questions became suddenly relevant, and also how this developed, and so there is a big variety of in another chronology was what happened in the Gulf, and at the same time what happened in the Middle East. And that was just something that fascinated me, and I did it, and so it also got into this book. That's a sort of short introduction, or well, it's. I think I've said enough. I will leave you to your.
Very interesting. I would like to ask you one question before I leave the room for the audience to interact with you more. I have this interest, I want to know. As you said, you've been in Abu Dhabi since 1967.
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask you as an individual, and from your own experience, how this rapid and dramatic change in the UAE affected you as a person. In other words, what is not written yet in the books?
Well, that is a very intriguing question, Musa. Yes. What has affected me the most is maybe the essence of your question. And I must say that to live in a place first of all, I must say, David is British, I'm German, and we lived in a third society, culture. And I think that was by coincidence. It was a wonderful thing that we, nobody was processing the environment vis-a-vis the other. And in this environment which we then shared, we were privileged to have made many, many friendships with local people, especially in the beginning. And these friendships prevail and are still extend. And that was, thank you, that has certainly influenced our life enormously. Then another aspect of this was very obviously that I found a field which had been unplowed, undiscovered, unused, and the finding of it really had something to do with what's written on the back of this book here, that, as I said earlier, the Gulf was uninteresting for academics and certainly also for journalists, until this bombshell that the British government suddenly decided we take this protective umbrella, which really meant militarily and diplomatically protecting these countries. We just take this in 3 years. And suddenly there was a buzz particularly in Britain, and all the journalists suddenly felt they have to descend on this place and see what it is all about. I mean, not only here, but Bahrain and Qatar and the whole area. And then academics also felt, well, maybe there is something to be talked about, there's something to be found. And I was lucky enough to be on the spot already. And I had, before I married David, I had finished my PhD, and that was a published book. So I can also say that I had the confidence that I could put a few words together. Alas, better in German than in English to begin with, but everything I wrote to begin with was in English, and David, nothing went to the press without David's scrutinizing my grammar and so on. Now I can also do something on my own, but what I wanted to say was that I had the reason to look at what changes were going to come here, because I could see with increasing wealth, because the oil export was accelerating, and with the changes also with Sheikh Zayed bringing all the changes that people had been waiting for since the 50s, and they knew from what people in Kuwait had already enjoyed, in Bahrain, in Qatar. Now it's coming to us, and people were impatient, and all this was very, very quickly coming. But what does it do to a society if you suddenly move into a different house where you have, it's lovely, you have, all the commodities that make life easier, but maybe you don't live next to your kith and kin of your family, because maybe their house is quite far away. Whereas in the past, the Barastis, the Arish were all in their own neighborhood, and how does society change and how fast? And for me, it was to try to understand what it changed from. And I had to understand that first, because I had, my PhD was on something to do with Berlin and nothing to do with tribes or Islam or the kind of life that people were living here. And I had to learn that, I had to understand that. And that was really the beginning of my wanting to also write something about it. And because I realized you learn best if you are disciplined to write it down as well, or explain it to others. And the incentive then was this sudden interest of the bigger, wider world in the Gulf. And then I saw these journalists coming from Financial Times, Richard Johns and others, and they came sort of every 4 or 5 months, and they mostly wrote about the physical changes, which you can see when you come periodically. You see there are buildings that are 3-story high, and there are now roads, and there's this and that being built. And I thought, well, there's more to the story than physical change. And that, again, made me inquire this. And so the first articles, that when I went to Oxford for this conference, was actually a transition. The word transition came in the title. And that transition, that was the most important issue to look at. So I didn't answer entirely your question, because you know, to have been able to enter this field, and then really it was lifelong. It was then it broadened out that I had the chance to also to travel to all the neighboring Emirates. I had been asked by the University in Heidelberg. They had a project which never quite gelled, but anyway. And on behalf of writing for this project, I went to Bahrain, I went to Qatar, I went to Oman, and in all these cases I had a reason to ask questions in the highest places. And in those days, and I also went to Yemen, to Sana'a, and Taiz and so on, and it was amazing that people everywhere, they were so happy that anyone took an interest in their society. So anyways, through this I learned a lot, and it was all building blocks which I could use in later analysis and understanding and so on. So I was extremely lucky. And this really was my life, and still is, because
Amazing.
Still is. So that's why I felt I wanted to put this together.
Interesting. I will leave the floor for the audience. So if anybody have or has a question. أسماء؟ في أسئلة؟
Thank you, Dr. Frauke, for first, you love my country. I think should everybody from our country, we appreciate somebody from 67, you live here, and still you have same feeling for my country and my heritage and my history, and you work every day, every day. I know you from near you, and you are one of influencing me to be here also. You and David, yani, always I said, every year I do it for you and David. Thank you to encourage me to be part of the book fair, and to encourage me to be a woman, to be also in the society. Thank you for everything. You changed in my life and my country. Thank you very much. Really, I appreciate what you do.
Thank you, Asma. Thank you for continues for 10 years now, also opening our view into Arab culture and Arab literature, which we wouldn't have had the same insight if we hadn't been able to come here every year and listen and try to understand what people here had to say. Thank you.
Ramadan time, this time, don't ask me to come back.
Yes.
Always we have this discussion with Dr. Frauke in Ramadan time. Asma, are you going? I said, no, Frauke, I'm tired. But she said, okay, you are coming.
Yes.
But this year we eat iftar, we be relaxed. And congratulations for your book.
Thank you.
My question, when you will translate it in Arabic to read it?
This I don't know whether and when it will be translated, because that is quite a long process and a costly process. The first book, From Truthful States, was actually the translation was sleeping in the cupboard for 10 years. It had been translated by someone who worked with us in the center, and finally it was published. But for instance, the German translation was, it was difficult to get it done because it's very expensive. Translators need to live. And yeah. This book here, maybe I have to add, I did, when it was announced that I would present this book here, I told Dean in an email that the book is available at a bookshop, or the representation of a bookshop called Kraidia from Beirut, but Mr. Hani Kraidia in the end couldn't come because his father is in a coma, and so he had to stay in Beirut. But the box of books was already on its way, so we took it out from the shipper's hands, and we do have some books here. But I must add that it's the book that was published in Berlin in December and November, and it is for the European market and is hardbound, and really the target is universities and European and American universities. So I'm afraid it is very much more expensive than books would be that are marketed here. So that is a caveat, but it is available. Yeah, I have about
we'll read it in the
6
book
or 7 copies.
Inshallah, next time for discussion the book with you.
Yes.
Next meeting in my home.
Inshallah.
Inshallah,
Yes,
sure.
yes.
Promise, inshallah.
Bikul surur. Yes.
Inshallah, ya marhaba.
كل سرور. Thank you, Doctor. Somebody have a question? Dean? Dean. Sorry.
After you.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. Frauke, thank you very, very much. And of course, Mr. Malafo as well, thank you very, very much for organizing this lovely salon. It's an honor and a pleasure to be allowed to be here. Dr. Frauke, you've been here 50 years, and I've been here less than 2 years. So you can imagine that there are actually many, many questions that I would like to ask you, and I would like to ask David as well. And just as an anecdote, before I came to Abu Dhabi, I'm the ambassador, the Dutch ambassador here. Before I came to Abu Dhabi, as ambassadors do and diplomats do, you kind of ask around and you wonder, which book should I read before I go to this country so that I understand a little bit about the country before I get there? And the book that was recommended to me first and most was your original book. So I'm very much looking forward to this new book, and I'm sure it'll be just as great as the original one.
Well, I hope it has helped you to understand this wonderful
Absolutely,
country.
very much, very much. As I said, many questions, but of course I must restrict myself. So one question that I was wondering, looking back with looking at this country after those 50 years of being here, what do you feel that makes the UAE stand out most in the GCC and in the Arab world? And I don't mean it in the sense because everybody who lives there, I think, realizes that this is a wonderful country. And reading your book and hearing from others how this country has developed so amazingly fast, that in itself is incredible. But what do you feel is the essence of the UAE as a country and that makes it different to the other countries in the region? Thank you.
Well, it is an easy and a difficult question. It is, I think, the one answer certainly is that it is, I mean, we all know that Sheikh Zayed was the ruler of Abu Dhabi only when he took over in 1966. And then in 1971, the UAE was founded. Now, many people now sort of just shorten the events by more or less portraying that there was Sheikh Zayed and there was Sheikh Rashid, and they sat at the border and they agreed, and they had the vision that this country was now going to be a federation. It was anything but that easy, because there were all the outside spectators that were looking in, or participants, because the agreement actually, in the first instance between these two rulers, actually meant we invite, and they did invite the other trucial states, rulers, and Bahrain and Qatar, and there were 3 years of discussion about a federation of the 9. and to keep that to the right point and to arrive eventually at a state that was viable, that in itself, I think, is a fantastic story, and would, you know, need to be repeated more often. And in this, we know that Sheikh Zayed had the leading role. And why? Because he did not want to hog the, you know, I'm doing this as my country. Not at all. He was voted for by the other rulers, and by the 6 Trucial States rulers, to become the president of the United Arab Emirates when it was founded. And it was, in the constitution also, it said that after 5 years, the president is being voted for again. And the fact that Sheikh Zayed then was lifelong the president of the UAE was thanks to the fact that he had really put at the disposal of the entire Trucial States and later of the entire United Arab Emirates the wealth of Abu Dhabi. And that is something that, if we think of other oil-producing countries, to be generous with wealth is not absolutely normal. If we look at Iraq, for instance, in the times of Saddam Hussein, what did he do with the fantastic wealth of Iraq? He used it to frighten his people and ultimately frighten Washington and Europe and so on and so forth with stacking up on frightening things. And this approach that the wealth of this country, the resources, are given by God, and we as rulers are really just administrators of this wealth, was at the essence, I think, of his approach to this situation. And so to be a good brother and to share with others meant that first they were sharing with the Trucial States even before the country, before the UAE was founded, and then to put Abu Dhabi's money at the disposal of the United Arab Emirates federal ministries is, it's not in the constitution, because it says it just belongs to Abu Dhabi. Anyway, and then with this wealth also to make, to attempt and then to succeed actually in organizing a foreign policy that was based on brotherly cooperation, be it sometimes helping financially Africa, the other Arab countries, the states, the Arab states that were very antagonistic to the Gulf states, in particular to the UAE, and in the beginning, and to soften their antagonism and to make them brothers. That was initially a very, very astute policy. And then we should also not forget that in the 70s until the 90s, there was the whole history from the First World War, well, from First World War onwards, that there was communism, a huge, big elephant in the room of the world. And how does one deal with this big elephant, of which one knew it was antagonistic to Islam? But why and how, one didn't quite know, and so on. You know, this decision that one shouldn't antagonize the, well, particularly Moscow in particular, but at the other hand also be not entirely negative, and to be able to sort of go on the tripwire, and all these decisions, I think, were very, very well taken, and has put the UAE in a very good starting position, I think, to continue after Sheikh Zayed's death, to continue on this very good track of being well, very cooperative and being seen to be. And sometimes also take the lead And I know also in the 70s there were many confrontations within the Arab world where Sheikh Zayed's confidants were sent to help to mediate and be helpful and so on. This idea that, you know, we should be, wherever possible, we should help to de-escalate confrontation, which also then went into the idea that, for instance, the Red Crescent here is very proactive when it comes to helping in conflict zones, demining in South Lebanon, helping with Afghanistan and so on. That's all part of the picture. I don't want to go into the details, but there's not an easy answer to your question. And I'm sorry if it was a bit long-winded, but that's also something that is quite close to me.
أم غانم دين تبغى تسأل دين okay last question.
Dr. Frauke, thank you very much for this session. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. And since you're a person who have seen and lived the transformation, specifically of the UAE and Abu Dhabi, I want to ask your personal opinion, which decade was your favorite? 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, post-millennium, now? And is it reflected in the book? Were you biased towards one decade than the other?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Thank you, Dean. No, I don't think I was biased in this collection, no. But my personal, you know, we ask ourselves sometimes as well. And I would probably say that from about 75 to 85 was my favorite decade. It's, you know, halves, but for several reasons. But in particular, I think in all the 70s, really, there was so much positive. Everything was you know, changing. There was a buzz of new projects, and they were all falling together. It was all getting right, and one still was close enough to see how it was all working, and feel that one could, with all one's heart, also be an ambassador to this country abroad. And later, of course, things became much more complicated, and also between 75 and 85 was the time when our children were small, and well, creature comfort was a bit easier. You could buy many things. Also, I never missed, really. I'm not a good cook, so I never missed the shops. But nevertheless, life was much easier. Yeah, and just lovely. Yeah, all the beaches were still open, and we went to Oman, and, you know, we went camping and so on. Life was really wonderful at that particular time. Yeah. Not that it's bad now.
Thank you, Dr. Frauke, for your valuable presence here with us in the Salon Al-Multaqa, and thank you for all the valuable information that you've shared with us today. Thank you, Asma, and thank you, David, for coming and supporting your wife. Thank you very much, and thanks all.